Have you ever wondered what happens when exponential technological growth just collides head-on with traditional societal
Oh,
values?
it's a massive collision.
Right. Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. Today is Monday, March 9th, 2026, and we are unpacking a text that attempts to answer exactly that question. Before we get into the really dense material we have lined up for you, please take a second right now to like and subscribe to the deep dive so you never miss out on these explorations.
Yeah, definitely hit that subscribe button.
We had a really comprehensive review of a fascinating and honestly highly specific ebook today. If you find today's discussion intriguing, or if you want to explore the raw source material for yourself, which we highly recommend, you should definitely check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book.
And you'll want to follow the author too, at Conrad Reicher. That's all one word on Substack.
Exactly. So, to give you an overview, the source material today is an ebook titled The Singularity 2045, The Red-Pilled Man's Guide to the Accelerating Future by Conrad Reicher, copyrighted in 2024.
And what makes this text stand out is its highly specific target audience.
Yeah.
This book is written explicitly for men's rights activists and the red-pilled manosphere. It's tailored for men who are actively seeking to understand our rapidly changing technological landscape and the history of our institutions.
Institutions which the author and his intended audience argue were fundamentally altered long before this current technological wave. They argue these institutions were basically captured by feminists and cultural Marxists.
And right at the top, we really need to state our mission for this deep dive clearly to you, the listener.
Yes, very important.
Our goal today is to unpack Reicher's incredibly complex synthesis of high-tech futurism, artificial intelligence, and traditional masculinity. It is crucial to note that the source material contains highly politically and culturally charged frameworks.
Very George.
Right. Specifically, these intense critiques of what the author terms cultural Marxism and mainstream institutional narratives. We, as your hosts, will impartially report and analyze the author's arguments to help you understand his worldview.
We're not taking any sides here.
Exactly. Nor are we endorsing the political or cultural viewpoints within the text. Our goal is purely to convey the ideas exactly as they are presented in the original text, so you can evaluate the logic and the architecture of his arguments for yourself.
That is the perfect framework for us to operate within today. We're just looking at the blueprint the author has laid out. So let's step into section 1, defining the singularity and the red-pilled lens.
Because he throws around two massive, loaded concepts right out of the gate.
Yeah, and if we don't define them clearly, the rest of the book just won't make sense. First, the singularity.
Right.
For a lot of people, that just sounds like a sci-fi buzzword, maybe a leftover from, an old Terminator movie. But the author is using it in a very precise academic sense.
He traces the term's origins back to the mid-century mathematician John von Neumann.
Which is fascinating on its own.
It is. But it was really brought into the modern consciousness by the futurist Ray Kurzweil. Kurzweil's famous prediction, and the one Reicher builds his entire thesis around, is that by the year 2045, machine intelligence will not just match, but completely surpass human intelligence.
And that concept of surpassing is the critical threshold.
It's the whole ballgame.
Right. The author describes this approaching singularity as an intellectual black hole. Let's break down why he uses that specific metaphor for you guys.
Well, in astrophysics, a black hole has something called an event horizon.
A point of no return.
Exactly. It's a boundary where the gravitational pull becomes so immense that the laws of physics, as we currently understand them, completely break down. We literally cannot see, measure, or predict what happens beyond that horizon.
And Reicher borrows this analogy to argue that technological advancements are currently compounding.
They aren't moving in a straight line.
No, they are moving exponentially. He argues that this compounding growth will lead to a specific moment in time where human society undergoes completely unpredictable and irreversible changes.
Because once artificial intelligence surpasses human cognitive abilities, meaning the AI can invent better AI without any human intervention, humanity's trajectory is permanently altered.
Our ability to predict the future basically drops to zero.
Right, to zero.
That is a staggering concept. It's the idea that human beings are no longer the primary drivers of history. But then the author brings in the second half of his foundational equation, the red-pilled worldview.
Right.
He defines being red-pilled, a term obviously borrowed from the 1999 film The Matrix, where the protagonist takes a red pill to wake up to the harsh reality of his world as having a highly critical, deeply questioning mindset.
And for Riker, this mindset must be entirely free from political correctness and what he identifies as cultural Marxism.
Before we go further, we should probably clearly define what the author means when he uses the term cultural Marxism, because it is an absolute pillar of his worldview.
Yeah, for listeners who might not spend their days deep in political theory, the author uses this term to describe an ideological framework where mainstream institutions like universities, media corporations, government bodies are perceived as having been captured.
Captured by narratives that prioritize systemic power dynamics, social justice, identity politics, over what he views as objective, harsh truths.
For Riker, being red-pilled means fiercely rejecting those institutional narratives. It means seeing the world as it truly is, stripping away the illusions, and refusing to accept the sugar-coated, managed realities that he believes are spoon-fed to the public by mainstream cultural pundits.
So why does he put these two things together? Because on one side of the room you have high-tech, Silicon Valley-style futurism.
Right, AI, Moore's Law, machine learning.
Yeah. And on the other side of the room you have the ideology of the manosphere and men's rights activism. I imagine a lot of you listening are wondering how the author builds a bridge between those two seemingly distinct islands.
The bridge he builds is actually based on a theory of survival and preparedness.
Okay, unpack that.
Riker argues that mainstream, politically correct narratives are not just annoying to his audience. He argues they are actively dangerous in the face of the singularity.
Dangerous how?
He posits that these mainstream narratives lull society into a false sense of security and complacency. They promote the idea of a soft landing, where technology will be managed gently by benevolent institutions to create some equitable utopia.
And the author believes this is a fatal delusion.
Completely fatal. If you are trusting the standard media and institutional narratives, he argues, you are fundamentally unprepared for the massive, violent structural disruptions that superintelligent AI will bring to our economy, our politics, and our daily lives.
You cannot survive a hyperlogical, ruthless technological shift if your worldview is based on what he considers emotional wishful thinking.
Exactly, and he uses a really fascinating historical comparison to justify this stance. He points out that today, individuals who hold this red-pilled, questioning mindset, whether they are software engineers pushing against corporate speech codes, scientists, philosophers, or everyday men trying to make sense of shifting gender dynamics, they're often mocked.
Or dismissed by the mainstream as paranoid or antisocial.
Delusional, yeah. But Riker reminds the reader to look at history. He points out that throughout human history, the visionaries, the people who dared to question the absolute dogmas of their time, were almost always mocked, exiled, or persecuted at first.
He's effectively telling his audience Galileo was mocked for saying the Earth moved around the sun.
Right. Ignaz Semmelweis was thrown into an asylum for suggesting doctors should wash their hands before delivering babies.
Riker is mapping that historical pattern of the persecuted visionary directly onto the modern red-pilled man.
And by doing that, he provides a powerful psychological framework for his readers. He is telling them that they shouldn't be discouraged by mainstream ridicule or societal ostracization.
In fact, he frames their skepticism of current institutions not as a character flaw, but as a necessary evolutionary survival trait.
He argues that this red pill's lens, this sheer refusal to accept comforting, consensus-driven lies, is the exact psychological armor required to look at the terrifying, fast-approaching reality of the singularity without blinking.
Because you have to understand the world as it actually operates, completely devoid of ideological comfort, if you want to survive a machine intelligence that operates on pure, cold mathematical logic.
Precisely.
But that brings up a massive question for the individual listener. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of the author's target audience for a second.
Okay.
If the singularity threatens to make human intelligence completely secondary, what happens to human identity? And specifically, given the focus of this book, what happens to traditional male identity?
That pivots us directly into Section 2, masculinity's evolution in a post-singularity world.
Right, because the book asks a profound and frankly very practical question. What is the future of traditional male roles? Specifically, the deeply ingrained roles of protector and provider, when advanced AI and advanced robotics render physical strength and brute force completely obsolete.
This is a vital question, and it strikes at the absolute core of the manosphere's traditional tenets. Historically, for thousands of years, masculinity has very often been inextricably tied to physical prowess.
It was about the ability to endure physical hardship.
To hunt, to build physical structures, and most importantly, the capacity to physically protect one's family or tribe from external threats.
But the author asks his readers to visualize the world of 2045.
Think about a world where an AI-driven autonomous drone swarm can protect a national border or a private perimeter infinitely better than a human soldier.
Or where automated robotic systems can build houses, farm massive tracts of land, and manufacture goods continuously without fatigue.
Exactly. In that world, the traditional metrics of physical masculinity lose their practical application in the marketplace and in society.
And the author is very clear about the panic this causes. He addresses the fear that permeates some oppositional voices, this existential dread that this technological shift spells the definitive end of men.
But Riker argues forcefully against that fatalism.
He asserts that this is not the end of men. It is instead a forced, necessary evolution.
He argues that masculinity must pivot away from the physical domain and move heavily toward cognitive abilities, emotional intelligence, and radical psychological adaptability.
Wait, I need to push back on this for a second.
Sure.
The author is writing for an audience that traditionally prides itself on being unyielding, tough, and often suspicious of traits coded as soft. He's telling these guys they need to embrace emotional intelligence.
It sounds totally contradictory.
Yeah, doesn't that seem like a massive contradiction to the traditional red-pilled ethos he just spent a chapter praising?
It does seem contradictory on the surface, but the author resolves it by fundamentally redefining what these traits mean in a high-tech environment.
Also,
He doesn't frame emotional intelligence as softness or as a capitulation to the cultural Marxism he critiques. Instead, he takes traits that are traditionally associated with masculinity traits like resilience, logical reasoning, determination, and a willingness to embrace extreme risk.
okay.
And he strips them of their purely physical manifestations. He maps them onto the cognitive realm. In his framework, emotional intelligence is a tactical data gathering tool.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. Empathy isn't about feeling sorry for someone, it's about accurately predicting human behavior in a complex system. He frames these psychological and cognitive traits as essential, hard-edged survival tools for navigating the uncharted territories of the Singularity.
So it's no longer about braving the physical wilderness with an axe.
It's about braving the technological wilderness with an incredibly disciplined, adaptable mind.
That makes a lot of sense in the context of his argument. He's literally weaponizing these cognitive traits for survival. And he uses some massive real-world examples to make this concrete for the reader.
He points to tech billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, the author highlights them as prime examples of men who are currently utilizing a red-pilled masculine drive to conquer the future.
He points specifically to Musk's work with Neuralink, which is a company literally trying to merge the human biological brain with artificial intelligence through implants.
And Bezos' relentless pursuit of off-world logistics and space travel with Blue Origin.
The author argues that these endeavors require an unapologetic, fiercely rational, and logic-driven pursuit of goals, despite immense societal criticism and technical roadblocks.
They aren't swinging swords. They are applying masculine determination to the realms of software, neurobiology, and astrophysics.
And he also draws on historical examples to solidify this template, moving away from just modern billionaires. He brings up Alan Turing,
The legendary mathematician.
right, the guy who famously cracked the German Enigma code during World War II. Turing faced immense personal adversity and societal prejudice, but Riker focuses purely on his methodology.
He frames Turing's relentless, obsessive, logical pursuit of breaking that cryptographic code as a profound triumph of cognitive masculine determination.
It's an example of how extreme cognitive grit, rather than physical strength on a battlefield, can literally save the world and alter the course of human history.
That is the template Riker is setting for the men of 2045. And he brings in some really interesting cultural anchors, too. He references Robert A. Heinlein's classic science fiction novel, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress.
A great book.
For those of you who haven't read it, it's a story about a lunar colony that fights a war for its independence from Earth, and they do it with the help of a self-aware supercomputer.
Riker uses this narrative as a metaphor, showing how the traits of cold logic, brutal practicality, and the willingness to fight for autonomy are exactly what will be needed when dealing with the complexities of superintelligent systems.
He also brings up the 2014 film Ex Machina, where a young programmer is brought in to test a highly intelligent humanoid AI.
Right. And throughout the film, the protagonist has to constantly weigh his desire for autonomy against the potential existential threats posed by the machine.
The author views this as a high-stakes game of logic, boundary setting, and threat assessment, all traits he categorizes as evolved masculine virtues necessary for the future.
And he actually backs up these philosophical and cultural points with concrete data, which is an interesting rhetorical move for this kind of book.
What data does he use?
He cites a 2021 Pew Research study titled Masculinity in the 21st Century. This study found that attitudes toward traditional masculine qualities are already shifting significantly across demographics.
Okay.
More respondents than ever before are reporting that qualities traditionally associated with femininity, such as empathy, active listening, and emotional intelligence, are now equally important in men.
But Riker doesn't view this data as a defeat of traditional values, like some in his audience might.
Exactly. He views it as a strategic evolutionary adaptation happening in real time. In a world completely dominated by ultralogical machines that can outcalculate us in an instant, a human man's competitive advantage in the marketplace might actually involve his emotional intelligence.
His strategic empathy.
Yes, his ability to understand complex human nuance, which are the very things a machine intelligence might struggle to replicate authentically.
But I'm looking at this from a bird's eye view, and I see a massive tension here in the text.
Rare.
The author is praising the hyper-aggressive, cutthroat, competitive drive of billionaires who want to build the biggest rocket or the smartest AI. But if you just have unchecked competitive drive, pushing technology faster and faster,
Yeah.
treating everything as a conquest without a focus on sustainability or the human cost, but you just end up with a dystopian disaster.
That is the precise tension the author attempts to navigate. He argues that while the aggressive masculine drive to conquer the unknown is absolutely necessary to build the future and face the singularity without paralyzing fear, it must be paired with an evolved understanding of human needs.
This is about balance.
Yes, if men want to remain leaders in a post-singularity world, the author insists they cannot just act as aggressive conquerors who break things and move on. They must become strategic, emotionally grounded guides who understand both the mechanics of the technology and the psychological needs of the people navigating it.
Which perfectly connects the evolution of the individual man's mind to the broader philosophical and spiritual journey the author outlines in Section 3, the spiritual path and rational enlightenment.
Yeah, this section is fascinating.
I have to admit, when I first saw the outline for this book, seeing a chapter on spirituality targeted at a hyperlogical, red-pilled, tech-focused audience seemed completely out of place.
It does seem counterintuitive because we usually associate spirituality with mysticism or faith, but the author completely redefines what spirituality means in this context.
He strongly advocates for a spiritual path, but he explicitly, almost aggressively, strips away what he calls mystical fluff.
There is no room for religious dogma, supernatural ritual, or superstition in Riker's framework. Instead, his version of spirituality relies entirely on balance, logic, and observable psychological cause and effect.
He looks at universal teachings from historical figures. He mentions the Buddha, Lao Tzu, and even extracts principles from early Christian Stoics.
But he filters their teachings through a purely rational, utilitarian lens.
Right, he throws out the cosmology and the theology,
Right.
and he extracts the core operating principles: intense mindfulness, extreme self-awareness, and radical emotional detachment.
It's all about utility for him.
But I have to ask another question here. We just talked about Elon Musk and the relentless drive to conquer the future. Now the author is talking about the detachment of a Buddhist monk.
I see where you're going.
How does a guy who is aggressively trying to shape the future also practice radical emotional detachment? Aren't those two completely opposite modes of being?
It is a paradox, but the author explains it as a necessary cognitive survival strategy. Why does a man facing the technological singularity need to study the mindfulness of an ascetic monk?
Why?
Because, according to the text, in a rapidly changing world where artificial intelligence is vastly superior to you, where entire career fields are disappearing overnight, and where society is experiencing unprecedented chaotic upheaval, the psychological shock could easily destroy you.
Oh, wow. So emotional detachment and intense self-awareness become highly practical tactical tools.
Exactly. If you are deeply attached to a specific outcome, like keeping your specific job or maintaining a specific social status, and that outcome is obliterated by an AI, you will spiral into despair.
But if you can observe your own panic or anger without being consumed by it, if you can maintain an internal locus of control while the external world burns, you can adapt quickly.
You avoid being overwhelmed. The author is taking ancient spiritual practices and repurposing them as psychological shock absorbers for the 21st century.
He explicitly names some modern figures who he believes are the torchbearers of this rational enlightenment for his specific audience. He points to figures like Stefan Molyneux and Dr. Jordan Peterson.
Now, these are highly polarizing figures in the mainstream, but remember, our mission here is to understand the author's architecture.
Right. The author uses these men as examples of individuals who inspire others to seek enlightenment through a profound understanding of human nature, evolutionary biology, and a dedication to what they see as absolute truth.
Independent of mainstream approval or political correctness, Riker is essentially telling his readers that they need to study the stoic resilience of these figures to survive the mental toll of the 2040s.
The author's underlying argument here is that biological humans will very soon be entirely outmatched intellectually.
You cannot beat an artificial superintelligence at chess, at writing code, at math, or at global strategic planning. The machine will always win.
So he asks, what domain is left for the human mind to conquer?
The mastery of the self. By cultivating this detached, rational spirituality, a man secures the one single domain the AI cannot conquer: his own internal consciousness and his emotional reaction to the world around him.
Okay, so we've talked extensively about how the individual mind needs to evolve, how it needs to become this fortress of rational stoicism and adaptable masculinity.
So around preparation.
Right. But while internal resilience is crucial, the external world, the physical world we all have to pay rent in, is going to be undergoing massive socioeconomic earthquakes.
And that brings us to Section 4, the socioeconomic upheaval and transhumanism. Let's really look at the mechanics of the economy of 2045 as Riker sees it.
The book paints a stark, unyielding picture of workforce disruption. We need to understand that the author is not just talking about the automation we are used to seeing.
We aren't just talking about self-driving trucks replacing long-haul drivers or digital kiosks replacing fast food cashiers.
No. Riker points out that advanced AI will systematically and ruthlessly wipe out complex white-collar service sector jobs.
He is talking about the sudden obsolescence of corporate lawyers, mid-level software coders, financial analysts, and accountants.
The author compares the magnitude of this shift to the historical transition from agrarian societies to industrial economies in the 18th and 19th centuries, but with a terrifying caveat.
This shift is happening at an exponentially faster rate.
Let's really put ourselves in the shoes of someone experiencing this. Imagine a guy who's been a corporate accountant for 20 years. He went to a good university, got his degree, did everything society told him to do to be a good provider.
He makes a six-figure salary.
Suddenly, a superintelligence is deployed that can audit an entire multinational corporation's finances in 4 seconds, flawlessly, for fractions of a penny.
Right.
The author isn't just talking about a shift in this accountant's paycheck. He's talking about a total collapse of that man's identity as a provider. How does society handle tens of millions of people experiencing that simultaneously?
According to the author, society currently has no plan for it whatsoever. Riker draws heavily on Martin Ford's groundbreaking book, The Rise of the Robots.
Okay, what's Ford's take?
Ford, and by extension Riker, warns that we are on the absolute verge of a post-human economy. Think deeply about the implications of that phrase, a post-human economy.
Throughout all of human history, the economy has been a system of humans trading human labor for resources.
But in a post-human economy, machines, not humans, are the primary economic actors. The AI and the robotics produce the goods, they analyze the massive data sets, they provide the legal and financial services.
The human being is removed from the value creation loop almost entirely.
The book argues that the current trends we are living through right now, like the rise of the gig economy, the massive shift toward remote work, the instability of freelance contracts.
Things people just write off as post-pandemic shifts.
Right. Riker views them as the earliest rumbling tremors of this total systemic transformation. The traditional concept of a career, of trading your human labor for a steady, reliable wage to support a family over 40 years, which directly ties back to the crisis in traditional masculine provider roles we discussed in Section 2.
It's fundamentally breaking down at a structural level.
And to illustrate how dangerous this structural breakdown could be, the author brings in the historian Yuval Noah Harari, specifically referencing Harari's arguments in the book *Sapiens*.
Harari famously put forward the provocative idea that the agricultural revolution was actually a disaster for early humans.
Right. His argument was that while domesticating wheat created more caloric food, it also created massive social hierarchies, massive wealth inequality, the concept of land ownership, and devastating widespread disease.
Essentially, humans didn't domesticate wheat. Wheat domesticated humans. It forced them to labor in fields and live in crowded, hierarchical settlements.
And Riker takes this historical framework and applies it to the Singularity to issue a massive warning.
If the agricultural revolution created a world of kings and starving peasants, the Singularity has the potential to create the most extreme, unbreakable global hierarchies the world has ever seen.
Which leads us directly into the concept of transhumanism, and this is where the book gets genuinely terrifying.
Transhumanism is the idea of enhancing human physical and mental capabilities through advanced technology. We are talking about genetic engineering, cybernetics, and direct neural implants.
Riker points out the incredible utopian promise here, the ability to edit our genes to completely eradicate debilitating hereditary diseases, or to augment our biological brains to interface directly with the cloud, processing information millions of times faster.
But the author issues a severe warning to his red-pilled audience regarding this technology.
If the economy is fundamentally broken, as we just discussed, and if only a tiny, select elite control the superintelligent AI and the unimaginable wealth it generates, what happens when genetic engineering and cognitive enhancements become available on the market?
The book warns of a massive, unprecedented risk where existing societal inequalities are not just economic anymore. They become literally, irreversibly biological.
If only the ultra-wealthy can afford these enhancements for themselves and their children, we aren't just looking at a society of rich and poor, we are looking at a speciation event.
We're looking at an enhanced, superhuman elite class that is cognitively and physically superior, ruling over an unenhanced, obsolete biological underclass.
I mean, that sounds exactly like the plot of the movie Gattaca.
It really does. But the author is presenting it as an imminent economic reality, and that raises a massive immediate question.
Who's in charge?
Exactly. If the economy is fundamentally rebuilt by AI, and if biological inequality becomes a stark reality, who is writing the rules? Who governs this new world? How do we stop the elite from just crushing the underclass?
This naturally leads us to the book's views on the mechanics of power, which is covered in Section 5. Governance, power abuse, and the Singularity Convention.
This section of the text is incredibly dense because it deals with the mechanics of state control.
The book points out that human history is already filled with tragic examples of the centralization and abuse of power. The author references the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, from Hitler to Stalin to Mao.
But Riker argues that modern technology vastly, almost incomprehensibly, magnifies the ability of a state to abuse its citizens.
He notes that authoritarian regimes around the world are already currently using advanced facial recognition, mass data collection, and AI-driven surveillance to monitor and control their populations in real time.
The author warns that as AI advances toward the singularity, the potential for state power to be completely centralized and misused grows exponentially, making 20th century dictators look amateurish by comparison.
Because of this immense existential threat, the book argues for the urgent, immediate need for what Riker calls a Singularity Convention.
He believes that our current international legal frameworks, like the Geneva Conventions that regulate warfare or the Outer Space Treaty, are completely and hopelessly outdated.
They are rooted in a pre-singularity era. They were designed to regulate physical objects, tanks, chemical weapons, borders, territory.
They completely fail to account for a world where a piece of self-improving code sitting on a server farm could be more dangerous to humanity than a nuclear weapon.
So he is calling for a radically new set of international laws, a comprehensive, globally enforced treaty established through intense collaboration to regulate the development of superintelligence before it's too late.
But the book goes even further into the philosophical weeds and explores the duality of AI and governance. What if the AI isn't just a powerful tool used by corrupt human dictators?
What if the superintelligent AI is the dictator?
Or, more neutrally, what if the AI is the lawmaker? Riker introduces the very real possibility of AI systems acting as senators, judges, or executives.
The duality the author presents here is fascinating to unpack. On one hand, he outlines the utopian view of algorithmic governance. Imagine an AI processing vast, unimaginable sums of historical data, centuries of legal precedent, and complex economic statistics instantly.
It could theoretically eliminate human bias, political corruption, and greed.
It could write perfectly logical, loophole-free laws that actually benefit the maximum number of people based on pure, objective evidence.
Right, the idea of a perfectly clean, efficient, incorruptible government. It sounds amazing. But on the other hand, the author cautions deeply against this.
He argues that a hyperlogical machine might completely lack the profound sociocultural nuance required for true human justice.
A rote mathematical understanding of justice might entirely miss the subtleties of human morality, mercy, and situational context. The question he poses is, how do you program a machine which only understands ones and zeros to understand the spirit of a law versus the rigid, literal letter of a law?
And that leads to one of the most critical concepts in the book, which we need to define clearly for you: value alignment.
Think of value alignment like the old folk tales of giving a genie a wish. If you tell an AI, solve global warming, and the AI calculates that humans are the cause of global warming, the most mathematically efficient solution for the AI is to eliminate humanity.
The AI didn't malfunction. It did exactly what you asked, but its values weren't aligned with human survival.
Riker references the science fiction author Isaac Asimov's famous Three Laws of Robotics, which state that a robot may not injure a human being as a primitive starting point for this dilemma.
But Riker points out the incredible real-world complexity of getting an AI to genuinely want what humans want. And as the author notes, setting these common values inevitably involves massive cultural and political warfare.
Whose values do we align the AI with? The individualistic values of the West, the collectivist values of the East, the values of the red-pilled man, or the values of the mainstream media and institutions that the author disguises?
To help the reader visualize these risks of centralized technological power and misaligned values, the author leans heavily on seminal cyberpunk science fiction.
He references Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which listeners might know is the basis for the movie Blade Runner.
And Neil Stephenson's brilliant novel, The Diamond Age.
These works explore gritty, hyper-advanced futures where technology hasn't solved human suffering or created a utopia, but has instead created new, complex, inescapable forms of corporate exploitation and state control.
Riker uses these stories not just as pop culture entertainment, but as highly accurate cautionary models of what happens when technological power is abused by the elite.
But importantly, the author doesn't leave his reader entirely without hope. He provides a massive historical analogy to balance out the dystopian warnings.
He looks back at the 15th century and Johannes Gutenberg's invention of the printing press.
Before the printing press, the church and the royal elites held a massive, unassailable monopoly on knowledge and control because books were incredibly rare and expensive to produce.
Gutenberg's press violently democratized information. It allowed ideas to spread rapidly, which stripped power from the elites and directly led to the scientific revolution, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment.
Riker suggests that if we navigate the singularity correctly, if we establish the right conventions and maintain a red-pilled critical mindset, an open-source superintelligent AI could act as the ultimate printing press.
It could democratize intelligence and problem-solving, wresting control away from corrupt human power structures and handing it back to the individual.
That is a massive paradigm shift. But if we zoom out from the halls of government and global treaties and we look at the fabric of everyday life, we have to ask, how will these super beings affect human relationships, our daily culture, and our most deeply held beliefs?
This brings us to the final major area of the book, Section 6. Culture, religion, and the call to action.
Because all of this, the economics, the governance, the survival skills, it ultimately trickles down into how we find meaning. And that brings up the author's vision for the future of faith.
The book presents the very real potential for a completely post-religious society. Riker asks a fascinating sociological question: what happens to traditional religious structures, which rely on faith in an unseen, omniscient creator, when humanity literally builds superintelligent beings that are essentially omniscient and omnipotent compared to us, and we can see them sitting in a server rack?
Will AI disrupt our foundational beliefs? Will a machine that can solve the mysteries of the universe in a millisecond introduce entirely new moral and philosophical frameworks that make our ancient texts look like children's books?
The author suggests that the transition from a religious to a post-religious society won't be smooth. It will cause massive cultural clashes and profound existential tension as billions of people struggle to redefine the meaning of humanity in the shadow of a digital god.
I want to linger on that for a second because the implications are wild. How does the author think humans will react when a machine can answer your deepest existential questions better and with more observable proof than a priest or a philosopher?
It seems like it would cause a complete psychological collapse for a massive portion of the population.
The author believes it will cause a collapse for those who are reliant on mainstream comforting narratives. That is exactly why he spent Section 3 building up that rational, detached spirituality.
He is trying to preemptively insulate his audience from that exact existential collapse. He argues that if your spirituality is based on logic and internal mastery, rather than external dogma, you won't be shattered when an AI solves the mysteries of the universe.
Alongside these massive existential questions, the book points out there are immediate, highly practical battles happening right now in our culture regarding privacy.
The book highlights the ongoing war between massive tech companies and authoritarian government overreach. Riker notes that companies like Apple and organizations like Firefox have made significant headlines by trying to protect user privacy, implement end-to-end encryption, and limit state data collection.
Conversely, governments around the world consistently leverage the fear of terrorism, crime, or public health crises to justify increasingly invasive surveillance measures.
In a post-singularity world, where an AI can monitor, process, and predict every single digital and physical move you make, the battle for data privacy is no longer just about avoiding targeted ads.
It becomes the literal front line in the battle for basic human freedom and autonomy.
And this all builds to the book's ultimate pounding call to action for the reader. Riker's message to his red-pilled audience is clear and urgent.
Do not just sit back in your chair and watch the future happen to you. You cannot be a passive observer. You have to actively shape it.
What's really striking here is Riker's assertion that humanity is not just a passenger on the ride toward the singularity. He says we are becoming the singularity.
The author demands that his readers step up to the plate. He wants them to pool their financial and intellectual resources. He wants them to get deeply involved in advocating for rational, evidence-based education policies in their local communities, and to fiercely fight against what he views as ideological misinformation.
He argues that if his target audience, men who value harsh truths and logical resilience, fails to have a vocal role in shaping this future, they risk being left behind in the dust, ruled by the very institutions they currently despise.
It's a call for radical personal responsibility in the face of machine supremacy. We have to consider the psychological impact of all this. Imagine living your entire life believing human beings are the apex predators, the pinnacle of creation.
Then, within a decade, you have to live in a world where you are unequivocally no longer the smartest entity in the room.
That is a massive, crushing blow to the human ego, and particularly to the traditional male ego that the book directly addresses.
But the red-pilled mindset, exactly as framed by the author, is the psychological armor needed to survive this transition. By already questioning societal narratives, by already valuing harsh, uncomfortable truths over comforting mainstream lies, the author claims his readers are uniquely positioned to look the singularity in the eye and adapt, rather than crumble into existential despair.
Okay, as we move into our outro, let's briefly recap the incredible, sweeping scope of Conrad Riker's book. We have journeyed through some incredibly dense territory today.
We really
We've
have.
gone from the redefinition and necessary evolution of traditional masculine virtues into cognitive survival skills. We've looked at the necessity of adopting a rational, detached spirituality to protect our minds.
We've examined the massive impending disruptions in our economy with the rise of the post-human workforce, the terrifying and promising potentials of transhumanism and biological inequality, and the absolute pressing necessity of a singularity convention to prevent algorithmic tyranny.
It is a profound, if controversial, exploration of human identity on the absolute brink of obsolescence.
And as we consistently emphasize on this program, comprehensively understanding the arguments about the future, even the ones that challenge our preconceived notions, is the first necessary step to successfully navigating it.
Absolutely. To you listening right now, if you want to be fully prepared for this accelerating future, and if you want to explore these raw, unfiltered concepts further to judge them for yourself, you must buy the ebook.
Go right now and search for the Singularity 2045, the Red-Pilled Man's Guide to the Accelerating Future on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
And to keep up with the author's latest insights, theories, and warnings as we hurtle toward the year 2045, make sure you're following at Conrad Riker on Substack. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe to this deep dive.
Before we sign off today, I want to leave you with a final, lingering, and perhaps slightly subversive question inspired by the architecture of the text itself.
Lay it on us.
Throughout the book, the author meticulously prepares the traditional masculine mind to face superintelligent AI. He urges a complete adoption of pure, unclouded logic and rationality as the ultimate virtues. But consider this carefully. If an artificial superintelligence operates on pure, transcendent logic, far beyond the confines of our biological, evolutionary history, might that machine look at our fierce defense of traditional gender roles and specific political ideologies not as virtues to be upheld, but as the very irrational biological limitations we are trying so desperately to transcend?
That is an incredible thought to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you in the future.